the things in the Old Testament do, right, to draw on previous material. Does that make sense, everybody? Yeah? Okay, especially what scholars call a sort of Deuteronomistic material. Okay? And Zechariah itself, with this donkey and colt, might go back to some saddled donkeys, okay, in the story of the Absalom Revolt in 2 Samuel. Specifically, one Old Testament scholar named Douglas Jones says this about the author of Zechariah 9 through 14, says that he, quote, meditated the permanent meaning of 2 Samuel, okay, 15 to 16, which means that when we read Zechariah 9:9, we should not forget about Ziba, who is mentioned in that story, who provided David with a couple of asses for the king's household to ride on. And it was no doubt one of these that David made his triumphal entry on. Here's what this author suggests, right? This is an expert in Zechariah, says the guy who wrote this had clearly, in the back of his mind, like he knew this story from 2 Samuel. And these donkeys are, right, and this is not just a guy who put it on a blog, by the way, okay? This was published in the journal called Vetus Testamentum, all right? It's like one of the most prestigious Old Testament journals out there, okay? So he's got some clout to back it up, okay? And Jones's observations have been welcomed by other Old Testament scholars as well, who see a connection between Zechariah 9:9 and 2 Samuel 16. That's why, sorry, right? We jumped the gun a little bit on this one, I'm sorry, right? So we do have, some warrant, we do have some basis for making this connection. Matthew 21, Zechariah 9:9, and 2 Samuel 16:1 and 2. A, B, and C. Okay, now, before we get all the way there, I guess, we should try to, or I should try to help you with the background of that passage, because I don't know how many of you are super familiar with 2 Samuel 16:1 and 2, 15:30, the Absalom Revolt, etc. Now, what's happening here in 2 Samuel, okay, is that we're in the middle of what's called the Absalom Revolt. Do we know who Absalom is? Does anyone? Sorry, this is kind of like in class. I'm sorry, I can't help it. Who's Absalom? He's got the hair. Yeah, that's going to be his downfall. Who is Absalom? Anyone?
David's son.
David's son, exactly. Right? Now, Absalom, one of David's sons, right? Thanks, David. Is, to put it mildly, he's very frustrated with David. Because Absalom's sister Tamar has been raped and David has done nothing about it. Nothing. And so it seems like, based on that frustration with David's perceived lack of action and lack of justice, Absalom is basically now rising up and creating a revolution, a revolt against his father. And he does so by acting very militarily. He has a bunch of men, horses, and he's riding into Jerusalem at the city gate where kings and judges are supposed to adjudicate things, and he's setting himself up as the new king. In response to this, David, who is this famous warrior, right, does not decide to just go and fight his son. He ends up leaving Jerusalem. Okay? Probably in a strategic move in general, try to preserve some of the people of the city and its inhabitants. And, probably so he doesn't have to actually have a showdown with his own son. Now, during this episode in the life of David, in this Absalom Revolt, we as readers are faced with a very central theme in this story. And one of the central themes in the story of the Absalom Revolt revolves around loyalty. Loyalty to David. And David has some people who are loyal to him, yet there are other people, like Ahithophel, which is a funny name, right? But Ahithophel ends up betraying David, while other of his men remain loyal to him. We have another character, Ziba, who is the loyal guy who offers David donkeys loaded with provisions that are taking David up the Mount of Olives. Okay, and so we have a central, again, placement in this story, which is the Mount of Olives, which, by the way, is not mentioned very often in the Old Testament. Right. So it's kind of important. Okay, we've got donkeys, we've got the Mount of Olives, we've got Jerusalem, right? We've got David, or the son of David, all kinds of parallels. And then we have, of course, the theme, right, of opposition or rebellion to Yahweh's chosen ruler, because that is still David. And here's the theme. People are either with him or against him. Mount of Olives surrounding Jerusalem. Okay, so maybe you're already starting to see the parallels that can be drawn back to Matthew 21. So now if you look at your handout, I tried to help you out a little bit. I underlined a few things, but you're starting to see those things, hopefully, right? So let's look at, again, then, the larger context in Matthew 21. Here Jesus, like I said, riding from where? The Mount of Olives, okay? On 2 donkeys, into Jerusalem, being hailed as the Son of David. Okay? I would argue that's a pretty strong kind of parallel if we're aware of what's going on. If we're aware of what's going on. Now, it might not be just a parallel, just an intertextual link to 2 Samuel. There is a very notable New Testament scholar who disagreed with me. His name is John Nolland. He didn't disagree with me, but he just thinks there's a clear reference here, not to 2 Samuel, but actually to Genesis 49:11. We also got some donkeys involved in that, and that was his argument. Now, he uses the same strategy that I did with the window reference, so we're friends on that account. He just tends to see the main intertextual frame being Genesis 49, and I tend to see 2 Samuel clearer in there. But as I will argue with you, that is not, in fact, a problem, but we'll get to that eventually. Now, the point is here that I want to make is that these intertextual links to the Jewish scriptures, right, obviously work in Matthew's gospel as sort of a narrative device. Usually, Matthew uses these quotations, right, to give us some sort of fulfillment. That's the main way he's been doing it since the beginning. These things happen in order to fulfill what's written in the scriptures. These things happen in order to fulfill this, fulfill this, fulfill this, or whatever. However, with this one, it seems like this intertextual link is meant to create not a fulfillment necessarily, but at least a stark contrast. All right, and if we read the triumphal entry alongside 2 Samuel, we begin to see some ironic reversals of different stories from the life of David. Right? We have in Matthew then 21, Jesus is what? He's entering into the city, whereas David is fleeing from the city. David is also, of course, reported to in the story of the Absalom Revolt. Like, he's brought this on himself. I mean, this is his own doing, right? This is his own lack of justice, his own inability to do what is right as the king. And Jesus, has he brought anything upon himself? Has Jesus done anything that is unrighteous? Okay, I got a few shakes. Okay, good, thank you. Like, you're still awake. No, he hasn't, right? He hasn't. And you might think, okay, well, that's just irony, Mark. Like, that doesn't mean that's necessarily there. I'm like, okay, I understand. But here's the problem. You weren't trained by Jerry Camry Hoggett. And those of you who know. He was my teacher while I was here. He wrote a whole book on the irony in the Gospel of Mark. Okay? So I'm just going to say irony is a thing. Okay? Irony is a thing, not just something that like English majors and professors make up to make life difficult for you or whatever. It's an actual thing in literature. Okay? It's an actual thing in literature. And David's already been using it. It's not the